Well, hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And this is part of our South Asia and Southeast Asia week. So we're looking at histories from that part of the world with a connection to World War II. And I hope you enjoyed Sri's presentation yesterday about the Indian Air Force. It was really informative. Lots of good feedback about that. I'll tell you now, lost my show on Friday about the Indian Navy. Long reason. We'll try and reschedule it sometime later. I'm trying to find a replacement show for Friday, but Wednesday and Thursday we're still on for that. But right now, we're looking at the 1940 era, Dunkirk and that era. But I'm really excited about this one because it's a book that's been doing the rounds and getting a lot of praise. And I'll be looking forward to speaking to my next guest. So Dr. Ghee Bowman is joining us from Exeter. Good evening. How are you doing?
Hi, Paul. I'm doing all right. Thank you. Very nice to see you.
Is it hot there?
It's pretty warm, but it's cooling off now that it's kind of 7. It's been very hot all day, but it's getting a bit cooler now.
Same here, basically. So, how did you get interested in this particular story? You know, I mean, you teach history, you're a historian. You know, but this particular aspect, did it discover you the story, or did you discover it?
No, I think it discovered me. I was working on a project a few years ago in Exeter, a project about Exeter's multicultural history, and I came across some photos in a book about Devon during the war. 3 photos of Indian soldiers wearing turbans with mules. And they were in Devon. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I thought I knew a few things about the war, but I'd never heard of Indian soldiers being in Devon or being in Britain at all, in fact. And so there were these photos. So I went to the National Archives in London and I found one of the war service diaries for the 25th Company of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. And I read that diary in the National Archives, and it was just a great story. And it just absolutely gripped me. And it gripped me. And these guys were some of the guys who were actually at Dunkirk. It gripped me to such an extent that I was reading about how they got to Dunkirk and where they went and how they escaped, on the 29th of May, got to Dover. And I was moved by it. I was actually moved to tears by reading this story. And I thought about all the kind of everything I knew about Dunkirk and everything I thought I knew about Dunkirk, 340,000 men, evacuated over a period of those 9 days. And amongst them were these 600 Indians that I never knew about. And so I was just kind of gripped by the story. And I followed it up and I went back to university and I did some more studying. And one thing led to another. And then eventually it led to the book.
And it's led you here tonight. So, and I think, as we just chatted before going live, it's so important that we are now looking at World War II from a multicultural, multiracial point of view, because as much as I like all the classic films of the 1950s and 60s, you never see anything other than a white face. And everyone's either upper class or they're the Cockney, and you don't even see, Northerners represented, let alone Indians, let alone Nepalese. And so it's important now with something as important to the progression of World War II as Dunkirk, which was that, as we all know, a kind of a victory claimed out of defeat. But it was everybody that came back. And, we've got Sean coming on in a couple of weeks' time talking about the Spanish volunteers that arrived in England with the French army. And it's all of the time, every time we learn that there's more people involved in our plays, so to speak, there's more characters, it brings more people into understanding history and feeling, I think that's important, feeling a connection with it, because we'll talk about this later, I think, but this idea that because of Britain's empire, because of our shady past around the world, but we do have this shared history, us and India and now Pakistan and Nepal. We have this history that goes back together, and sometimes the friendship was a bit fraught and there were partition, but there's this connection, and I think it's important. So
absolutely,
we'll leap into the presentation, and you've supplied us some great photos and slides and a bit of audio later up. So I'll kind of hand over to you to start talking, and then when I have questions or the audience has anything, I'll jump in my inimitable interrupting style. So over to you, Dr. Ghee Bowman.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, so these guys were from the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. So they were like the British Royal Army Service Corps. Their business was supply and transport. And they were needed at the beginning of the war in France with the British Expeditionary Force because the BEF, the planners had said, well, there was a motto, which was not a horse in the force. So these 2 photos on the right is a great photo from the Imperial War Museum collection of an Indian soldier on a ship. And on the left, these are these particular guys. So they were known as Force K6. And I still haven't really plumbed why Force K6 they were called, but there was also a K3 and a K7 and some other K numbers as well. Force K6, so when they arrived in France, which was December the 26th, so Boxing Day, 1939, they arrived at Marseille on 3 ships. They had come from Bombay through the Suez Canal. And they were 1,723 men and around 2,000 animals. So that's a pretty small group, but nevertheless significant in terms of their impact on, well, they were there for 2 reasons. Okay, so the Royal Army Service Corps, the British Army, had no animal transport left by 1939. They'd completely switched to motorized transport, and yet the war started. The British Expeditionary Force was sent to France, to northern France, and then there was a realization that actually they would need animal transport. They would need animal transport for conditions which were very steep or very muddy, or where they needed silence, where they couldn't afford to have the noise of the animal of the motors. And so these guys, there were 36 mule transport companies in the Indian Army at that stage, none in the British Army, and so they looked to the Empire. The planners looked to the Empire, and these guys arrived on December 26th. And then this photo is during the winter. This is actually taken in Marseille, and they were very well. They arrived south of France, but that winter was one of the coldest winters of the 20th century. These photos are a combination. In the bottom right-hand photo there, that's of the docks at Marseille, when they were unloading their mules from the ships. And the top right-hand photo is also Marseille, and the other 2 photos are actually from Britain, slightly later. There's a lot of film footage of these guys, an enormous amount of film footage of them from Pathé, because, as I said, there were 2 reasons. So one reason they were there was in order to supply the army, but the second reason was propaganda. They were seen as being a useful tool in order to talk to people in India and to talk to Britain, but also to talk to people in the Empire and around the world, to say, look, the Empire is helping out. This isn't just white British people. This isn't just the home territory, as it were. There are people coming from, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and also from India. And these guys were known as the first in the field, because they were the first bit of the Indian Army to be involved in the Second World War. And I guess I should say at this stage that, by the end of the Second World War, there were 2.5 million men and 11,500 women in the Indian Armed Forces. So it's an enormous amount of people. People talked about it as being the largest volunteer army ever. There was no conscription in India. Everyone who joined up was a volunteer, even though in some cases there was an element of, we're hungry and we need some, by joining the army we can get a decent income and a decent diet. Nevertheless, an enormous contribution to the war, and that was so. Particularly, so for example, East Africa, the campaign against the Italians, the Battle of Keren and so on. So the Battle of Keren, there was the first Victoria Cross that was awarded to an Indian soldier during the war, first of 28. And so East Africa, then North Africa, Alamein, Italy, Monte Cassino, lots of Italian soldiers there. And then, of course, majorly in Burma, the 14th Army, at least half of the 14th Army was Indian. So 2.5 million, and here we have around 4,000. Now these are a couple of photos from the early days. So these guys, I'll talk about the guy on the right. So he's a farrier. Okay, so they were in companies of around 320 men each. There were 4 companies when they arrived initially, and those companies, the majority of them were drivers. So by which I mean mule drivers. So these were not guys behind a steering wheel. These were guys who knew about how to look after animals, how to groom them, how to get the best out of them. And of course, along with those drivers, they needed all kinds of servicemen, tradesmen, followers. Farriers like this guy, the bloke who's actually responsible for putting the shoes on the animals, and then a blacksmith to make the shoes and people to support him. There were tailors, there were boot makers, there were cooks. So every day they were cooking literally hundreds of chapatis for the guys to eat and curry. we can talk more about food later if you like. And then every company also had a Maulvi, an imam, a religious, like a chaplain, a religious leader, because almost all of these guys were Muslims. 97.7% of them were Muslims, this particular force, and around half of the Indian army during the war was Muslims. So if we look at the photo on the left, this photo was taken in Marseille, and just after they'd arrived. The photographer was a guy called Len Putnam, who was the father of the film director David Putnam, a director and producer. So he was a photographer. He later became one of the photographers for the Army Film and Photography Unit. And one of the things this photo shows very interestingly is what they wore. So you can see that I love this photo. They're all smiling. The photographer's gone up on a crane or something, so there's a great angle. They've got these white jerkins, which they didn't use very much later, but they've all got a puggree on. They've all got a turban on, unlike the guy in the other photo who's got the forage cap. So, and the puggree is a two-part. It's made of two pieces. And this puggree was very much a marker of what was then called Punjabi Muslimans. So Muslims from Punjab. So most of these guys were actually from Punjab.
You can see the two parts there, can't you? I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in the middle, there's a cap, a woolen cap, a knitted cap, and then round the outside there's a long strip of cloth, a lungi, which is basically wound round. Now, if you go back to the previous photo, the one from there, so you can see there's two styles of puggree in that. So the guy in the bottom right, he's got three stripes. He's bottom left. He's a quartermaster daffadar. So daffadar is a sergeant in the cavalry, because they used the cavalry ranks because they were part of the service corps. So because he's a sergeant, he's got like a tuft on the top, which is like a peacock crest. That indicates that he's a sergeant or above. The other guys, the one of them's got one stripe, they have the end tucked in. They're just ordinary soldiers. They're lower rank NCOs. So that was a really kind of strong marker of rank, as well as stripes and other indicators of rank. They had this thing on their puggree. So they arrived in France, December 1939, 1940, one of the worst winters in the 20th century. They were spread out. So the four companies, two of them, one company went to Le Mans, which was the sort of in the central western France.
Central west, yeah.
Which of course you're in France, aren't you? Yeah. So that was
just down the road from me, essentially. Yeah.
Right, great. So that was the center for the lines of communication. One company initially stayed in Marseille, and then subsequently went up to the Maginot Line north of Metz with the 51st Highland Division, and we can talk more about them later. And two companies were posted to the British front line, so around Lille. So the 25th Company and the 32nd Company were posted to Lille.
If I could just jump in and ask a question, just to clarify something, because one of the things I learned from Sri in his presentation about the Indian Air Force is that I hadn't kind of remembered the threat in 1939 in India or the perceived threat from the Soviet Union. I kind of forget that there's that border as Afghanistan. So when we talk about Dunkirk and the BEF in France, we think of it from a British point of view of the immediate danger to our country because of the potential of overrunning the Low Countries and France and Britain. But if you're an Indian soldier in 1939 going to France, how did the British Army or the own Indian Army officers convince these Indians that what they're doing is for their own benefit? Because at this time, with what's going on in India, I mean, because they look very happy to be there, those photos, and I think we want to touch on how the masterstroke it was of allowing them to do their own cooking and their own. Because I was reading today about the Kachins in Burma, how when they got involved with the OSS, they were given American sea rations and American stuff, and of course they were ill because they weren't. The diet was different to what they were used to, and all those kind of problems. Mm-hmm. So having them being self-sufficient in terms of food is a masterstroke, and all the traditions and having their rank. But how did they motivate them, as I say, about going to France? Did they feel that was the important war for them?
That's a great question, and that became much true later on as well. So, as you say, at the beginning of the war, the planners in India were convinced that the threat was from where it would always be, from the northwest, from the
Yeah.
northwest frontier, from Afghanistan, and maybe from Russia, from the Soviet Union. In fact, the real threat came 2-3 years later when the Japanese invaded Burma and eventually came, literally knocking on the door in the northeastern corner. And so in addition to what you've said, there's the whole kind of question of loyalty. Where should, if you were if you were any kind of Indian person in 1939, why should you be loyal to the British Empire? Why should you fight for Britain? Because that is arguably against your own freedom. And of course, there was Subhas Chandra Bose, who had been the leader of the Indian Congress Party before the war, who actually said, well, yeah, this doesn't make sense at all. Let us fight against the British. So he raised an army initially in Europe and then subsequently in Asia, 45,000 or so, fighting on the side of the Japanese against the British. Mm. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. But that also features some of these guys as well. So, I think they went because they were told to go. I'm not sure how much, they were really knew where they were going. I mean, some of them were World War I veterans. I don't think any of these people in the photo are, but some of them had been to France already once in 1914 or 1915, which is extraordinary when you think about it. But
yeah, and again, it's testament to their loyalty, because as we know, we could go off down an entire rabbit hole of the British government welching on deals they had struck in the First World War. Look at Lawrence of Arabia. Look at all the things we promised people who were fighting alongside us, who we then promptly pulled the rug under their feet at the end of the war and said, no, we didn't actually mean that. And the same applies to India, and it took another 30 years for partition. So these guys don't have to fight for us. I mean, we clearly, the British, as you said, need the Commonwealth. We need Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and all the dominions. But there's no absolute necessity for these guys to fall in behind us. It is at the end of the day not their war, and it's incredible that they came with such enthusiasm, albeit they were ordered. But that it's complicated.
Right. Yeah, and it is complicated, and it's particularly interesting when you think that amongst all of these 1,723 men, there were two officers who were Indian officers who had been commissioned. One of them was at Sandhurst, and who had been in as officers for a number of years, in fact. This is a lovely photo. Okay, so this is northern France. This is just outside of Lille. This is the 25th Company. This is April the 20-something of 1940, so about 2 weeks before the Blitzkrieg. And they had got into a regular habit by this stage of doing a gymkhana, of doing a variety of different kind of performances for the local people. So this is one of a series of photos, and the other photos show them dancing and playing music. So this is possibly the first time that Bhangra was played in Europe, and then doing some trick riding on the backs of the mules, and other kind of performancey things. And these are the guys who are the spectators. So at the front, you see some of the Indian soldiers, and some of them have got little French kids on their knees. And then at the back is the French civilians. You can see there's a gendarme with a kepi at the back, and in the middle is a woman clapping who's got the most appalling teeth, which I find very.
She's probably English on holiday then. In that case.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a lovely photo that really shows the warmth between these soldiers and the French civilians around them.
But being devil's advocate, Guy, I mean, because I like to do that, they could be staged. I mean, it looks genuinely sincere there, but we know that there have been occasions where, I mean, I think about for example, the Comanche code talkers that were in Normandy, who were forced by the US government to do all sorts of photos with headdresses and feathers and stuff, and you wonder whether it was their idea or whether they were being utilized for a part of a kind of propaganda. But genuinely, everyone looks very happy in that photo. Yeah. I mean, and you must, you went to the archives. You have. There are obviously testimonies from people who were there. So clearly they were enjoying themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, there are over 300 photos of them in the Imperial War Museum archives, and then plenty of others on top of that. So I'm not at all concerned that this is in any way staged. I mean, certainly there was a photographer there, and he was taking lots of photos of the day. But these guys are genuinely having a good time, yeah. Yeah. So this is now these two. So these two photos are from a bit later. So these were painted. These are portraits painted in 1941, painted in Hereford in Western England, and painted by a guy called Henry Lamb. And he was an official war photographer. He'd been in the army himself in the Great War, and he was an official war artist. Did I say photographer? Official war artist. And he spotted these guys at a railway station, and then he thought, oh yeah, they'll look good. So he followed them up. He went to Hereford and he painted the two of them. And on the left we have driver Abdul Ghani, and I know almost nothing about him apart from the fact that that was his name and his rank. Lamb wrote that he was that Abdul Ghani was quite unhappy because with the bandolier over his left shoulder, that was hiding his medal ribbons. So he was a bit upset that they couldn't actually see that. But and I like the way they're both. They're not. Neither of them are looking at you. They're not looking at the artist. They're looking out of the picture. And then on the right, this is a very important figure. This is Major Muhammad Akbar Khan. So at this stage, he is 40-something years. No, he's 50 years old. So he was one of the first Indians to receive a commission in the Indian Army. So his father was a senior Risaldar in the Province Horse. He himself joined the army in 1913 as a lowly recruit in the cavalry, and he very rapidly rose up through the ranks. He became a jemadar. He went to Mesopotamia in the Great War. Then he came back at the end of the war, and in 1919 he was on the first course, which was the first course that was training Indians to be officers. So there'd been this, as you say, this idea of independence, of kind of creating Indianization was the phrase. So making the officer corps become increasingly Indian, and the first way they did that was a course in India itself at a place called Dehradun, and he was one of the first men on that. So he was commissioned in 1919, and then he worked his way up until by the time 1939 came around, he was a major. So he was the only Indian officer on the beach at Dunkirk. So when we're talking about Dunkirk, he's the guy, he's the man. He then came with them back to Britain. Spent a while in Britain, met up with Leopold Amery, who was the Secretary of State for India, and kind of made all sorts of influential friends. And then he went back to India, and he did a number of things during the rest of the war, including he was in Burma. He was also being used as a recruiting, recruiting sergeant, but recruiting drive. At the end of the war, he'd risen to the rank of, I think, the end of the war, he was a colonel. By 1947, by partition, he was a major general. So at partition, India was split into two, into Pakistan and India, and the army was split into two as well, roughly a third going to Pakistan. He was at that stage the senior officer in the Pakistan army. He wasn't made commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief was a British guy, but he was made director of supplies and transport, but he retired soon afterwards. I kind of wonder whether he didn't really adjust to an independent army. But he was, and the reason I know so much about him is partly because he's well known, partly, but also because during the course of my research, I was very, very lucky to meet a lot of his relatives, including his one surviving daughter and lots of grandchildren and great grandchildren, one of whom is just finished his degree at Manchester University, and they're scattered across the world, and lovely, lovely people who were very forthcoming. So that kind of those two pictures in a way give you an idea of I suppose the spread of the guys who were there. Driver Abdul Ghani, probably looking at this portrait, he's in his 20s, so he was probably born sometime between 1910 and 1920. Obscure. I know very little else about him through my research. Akbar Khan, educated, sophisticated. Became a very successful soldier with an enormous amount of experience, and very much a kind of, very much a loyalist to the empire. I mean, by 1939, he'd already been in the army for 26 years and had been an officer for 20 years. So, really kind of the old school.
And that's worth mentioning as well. You know, that with not just India but other countries, people who had been aligned so long with the positivity of the empire, when the empire ends, they can sometimes be regarded by the new powers to be as kind of anti-establishment, although they had been very much pro-establishment but pro the old establishment. And it must have been a very difficult adjustment for some of these people to make, you know, in that you've dedicated your career to one way of seeing the world, so to speak, and now the world is slightly different, and you are very good at your job, but it's a new world. It's change is can always be a bit scary, isn't it? And but it's amazing that these people had such long careers. But you know, when you're talking about the chap on the left there, and when we go back to formation of this unit, because I say they all came from India, obviously, what were the requirements to join this unit? Were they people joining to get a uniform? Was there an education standard that had to be reached? Was it about horsemanship or mulemanship? What was the criteria for joining this unit in the first place?
So they had signed on to join the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. The ones who came out initially were all pre-war soldiers, you know. So Abdul Ghani had probably been in the army for quite a few years. His medal was probably a frontier medal. They just had to be reasonably strong. They didn't have to have any English. They had to be of a certain height. There's an interesting set of photos in the Imperial War Museum about the recruitment process, which shows the kind of medical checks that, although that's during the war rather than before the war, but it shows the medical checks that they were going through. They just had to have an aptitude for service. One of the important things about this is that the idea of the martial races. So the British Indian Army was recruited particularly in the Great War and the interwar period, recruited from Punjab, from the north of India, so particularly from Sikhs and from these guys who were known as Punjabi Muslims, so from right up near Rawalpindi, up in the north of Punjab. And there was an idea that, you know, that these guys were naturally warlike. They were warriors, you know, warrior classes, and they would fight better than anyone else. And of course, this was a myth. It was a myth, you know, and it's a myth that continues. And part of it was based around the people who'd been loyal in 1857. So the Mutiny Rebellion of 1857, the Sikhs had not rebelled against the British. Largely, those that had rebelled had been from further east and further south in the country. So so that was one of the. So if you were from one of those villages that I visited during my research in the north of what is now Pakistan, around Rawalpindi and Jhelum and so on, then it was quite a tradition for you to volunteer. These two photos are rather nice. The one on the right is from Devon, shows an Indian soldier with two British soldiers who I guess were home on leave. Unfortunately, he's not smiling very much in that one, but there's lots of photos that I've been sent and I've seen over the years from, you know, with an Indian soldier with a couple of British civilians or soldiers, sometimes children. The one on the left is from Scotland. This is from a little bit later, probably 43. This photo was taken. It's near Aviemore, and they were posted up in some of the coldest and wildest bits of Scotland, in tents. As you see, this is a traditional bell tent. You can see the mules in the background, and you can see the mountain behind them. So what happened to them was they were evacuated from Dunkirk. They came back to Britain. One company ended up in a prisoner of war camp. We can talk about that later. But they were then reinforced. So 3 more companies were sent from India. And the reason for that was that Churchill had this idea of a thing called Operation Jupiter. And that was to attack Norway again. So the British and French had been kicked out of Norway in early in 1940. But Churchill had this idea that to reoccupy some of the Norway coast, especially once the Arctic convoys started running. So once the Soviet Union was in the war, Britain was sending these convoys round the hump, round the top of Norway to supply Archangel and can't remember the name of the other port. And the Luftwaffe were attacking them from airfields in Norway. Churchill said, okay, we'll land a force on the north coast, we'll take those airfields and we'll hold them, and we'll try and, he also said, unroll the map of Europe from the north. It was an idea that nobody else thought was a good idea, but it was an idea that stuck around for a long time, and therefore they were training in the north of Scotland. They were British infantry divisions, the 52nd Division, for example, were training for this operation, and they would need animal transport. They would need mules to supply them, to supply the front line up in the cold mountains of Norway. And so that's what they were doing for a number of years in Wales and in Scotland, was training alongside British infantry brigades for Arctic warfare. Some of them were even posted to Iceland, and they were attached to a school, what was called the Arctic Warfare School in Glenfeshie, working with British soldiers on how you can operate in these terrible conditions.
And just worth reminding ourselves how important four-legged transport was in World War II generally. I mean, Niels Henkerman, who does lots of work with me, his forthcoming book about the Germans, approximately 4,000 horses per German division in World War II. With that, Lucy Betteridge Dyson does her work about the horses and mules in Burma, and we have this idea because of YouTube and videos of everything being panzer columns moving at speed, kicking up dust, or in the British case, Sherman columns or whatever at speed. But actually, there's a whole lot of need for four-legged transport. And as you said, there are things that mules can do that trucks can't do. There are things that mules can do that tanks can't do. So important to remember that. But I want to go back to Dunkirk, because we go back that initial story there. So they, you said that in Lille, places like that, because what their role, mule transport, because the invasion of France, there'd been this phony war period that we now think is a misappropriated use of the word phony. It wasn't phony elsewhere, but that's what we've come to call it, the phony war. And then sadly, the Germans attack and what have you. So how did this unit find themselves in the thick of it, and how did it get from there to Dunkirk?
Okay, so two companies, the 25th Company, the 32nd Company. 10th of May 1940, the Germans attack. The British move forth to on the canal, the Deal, is it pronounced Deal? I'm not sure. But these guys are actually left behind. They're still at their bases near Lille. And then confusion, and it gets very quickly a lot worse. Surprisingly quickly. And then the order goes out to retreat to Dunkirk. So the 32nd Company, they retreat first of all. They go back to Dunkirk. They get there on the 25th of May. And incidentally, amongst the officers, so every company had 3 officers, and in most cases, those were white British guys. Amongst the white British officers in the 32nd Company was a guy called Captain John Ashdown, and he was the father of Paddy Ashdown, the British politician. And he told a story. Captain John Ashdown told a story that he was ordered to abandon the equipment and to abandon the mules. Well, that happened to all of the companies in France. Ashdown says that he was also ordered to abandon his men, and that he refused to do that, and that he was therefore court-martialed, but actually eventually exonerated, which is a great story. But unfortunately, I've never found anything in the archives that bears out that story.
Oh, right, okay.
So I'm sorry to disappoint people who think that's a true story.
Because I was gonna bring up, as trite as it may be, because we know, even those of us who've seen the recent not that recent now, 4-year-old Dunkirk film, there is an issue of priorities in terms of who gets into the mole, who gets on this, and we know, the French perhaps didn't get a very good, accurate portrayal, and this, that, and the other. But when it comes to organizing people off the beach, what kind of priority did these Indian troops have? And I'm assuming they're not very high up on the list. I mean,
yeah. Well, certainly the useless mouths was the phrase, wasn't it? Get the useless mouths off first. So, and these guys being in service corps would have been seen in that way. So the 32nd Company went on the 25th of May.
Right.
So before Operation Dynamo officially started. So there were still evacuations happening then. The 25th Company, meanwhile, they were the company we saw in the photo with the watching the Gymkhana. They were kind of left without orders for quite a long time. This is Major Akbar's company. They were left without orders for quite a long time, and eventually they set off for the beaches on around the 24th of May, and they marched to the beaches with their mules, with all of their equipment. They also had a few trucks who were bringing up the wounded, but basically they were marching as a kind of mule column. And they got to, and they got bombed. They got attacked by the Luftwaffe. They heard, they were in close contact with German tanks. I mean, the whole thing just, it sounds kind of, extraordinarily confused and confusing. Some of them were killed in a train. They were shot up by the Luftwaffe, and then they eventually got to Bray Dune, which is just north of Dunkirk,
yep.
on the 28th of May. And there, more confusion, and they went onto the beach, and their commanding officer, Major Wainwright. I met his grandson the other week. See if I can quickly find the what he wrote. But he wrote about how, I can't find it, but he wrote about how crowded it was, and how people were wandering around without, soldiers wandering around without, any kind of command or structure or anything like that. So he was worried about that. He went off to try and get some lorries to move the wounded. He wasn't able to do that quickly. So in the afternoon of the 28th, Major Akbar marches the men along the beach. And I think that, for me, that's one of the kind of central images of this whole story. Is if you picture Major Akbar as we saw him with his puggree, his turban, and with 320 men, there he is. Yeah, 320 men, the mule drivers, the cooks, the farriers, the Molvi, the religious advisor who apparently was lame, so they had to carry him. And they're marching along the beach. They've got rid of all the mules, so they gave them to French farmers. They got rid of all their equipment. And I like to think they marched in step, that they actually marched, whilst the Luftwaffe were coming over. They actually marched along the beach. They got to the mole. They got to the mole, and it was chaotic. It was extremely chaotic. And Wainwright, the major, says that they were split up. They got, in the middle of the night, they were taken off the mole, and they were taken by a number of different ships across to Dover. And Akbar writes later in his memoir, he says that they got to Dover. He was with a group of them. They were all reunited soon afterwards, but they got to Dover, and they were at Dover Station waiting for a train to take them away. And the women, the WVS, were there serving them cups of tea and sandwiches and bananas. And of course, they took the sandwich and they took out the ham, because they were all Muslims, so they wouldn't eat the ham. And then they finished. Then they went to the women and said, "Can we borrow your trays, and can we borrow your kettles?" And they took the trays and the kettles, and they started to play some music right there on the station at Dover, and all the men started to dance, and all of the Tommies started to dance, and all the women started to dance, and they had a little dance before they got on the train and went off to somewhere a bit safer. So that's
an amazing story. That just to show that, I don't know what the word is, jubilant. I mean, they're just making the best of this situation. It indicates strong unit pride. It indicates a togetherness, that we're not beaten. Because let's be honest, a lot of units came back from Dunkirk. I mean, particularly those that had seen some very horrific combat. That they were broken for a while. I mean, the British Army was on its knees, had to be rebuilt, retrained. To think of bringing back a unit, albeit service corps personnel, but with that esprit de corps is really quite remarkable.
Absolutely. And they, there was in a way, each of these companies of 320 men, you've got your cooks, you've got your tailors, you've got your religious advisor. It's a bit like a village. It's a bit like a Punjabi village that has been transplanted into France. Obviously, no women, no children, but nevertheless. And so there is an incredibly strong bond between these guys. That most of them don't speak much English or French, although they were learning both of those languages. So yeah, they really stuck together. They looked after each other, and they had a kind of an esprit de corps and a sense of connection, which I think maybe was stronger than some of the British units. Yeah.
And just from the photos you supplied, as you said, there's lots more on Imperial War Museum and Pathé and National Archives. Clearly, they were popular with the press as well. I know there's an element of propaganda about that, but it's there's something about that look there, that photo there, that kind of sends a message out to the enemy as well, isn't it? Of who are you up against? Even if they're not infantry, but they're with the beards and the moustaches and there's a scary look about these guys. If I was an enemy, I would be I wouldn't want to meet these guys. You know?
Yeah, there is. That's right. And but interestingly, initially they were unarmed. I mean, when they arrived, they only had you saw a photo before with the swords, and the officers had pistols. But it wasn't until later in 1940 that they started to train them with rifles. So, but yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's a photo of them with rifles. Now, this photo comes from my city of Exeter. And I kind of thought it would be interesting to put it on there, and it because whilst they were in Britain, they took part in 61 different parades in London, in Birmingham, but also in very small places, or medium-sized places like Exeter. And here they are marching along the High Street past the Guildhall, which is all bricked up because it's a very old building, and they didn't want it to be destroyed or damaged by the bombing. And this was part of the warship. What do they call it? War Weapons Week. So it's a fundraising day, and they were joining in that because they spent quite a lot of time in Devon and Cornwall. And this is so they weren't actually stationed in Exeter, but they were stationed further south in Devon. Don't know how many Devonians are watching this evening, but there you go. That's one of the photos from Devon.
And obviously that's going to be the next part of the talk, is this connection they have with the people of that region of Britain. But I want to jump in again now and talk about this. I don't want to go too much into the modern politics, but people talk about this Dunkirk spirit. They talk about this Britain standing alone, which we weren't really, because it was Britain and its empire. And the fact you just said these guys do 61 parades, clearly what they were trying to convey to the British public, to the newspapers, is that we are all in this together. It is white people, brown people, black people all together. Why? It's a question that it's a rhetorical question essentially. But why today have we kind of gone back to thinking about Little England on its own, when even back in 1940 that wasn't the message that was being sent out? This photo is absolutely not saying Little England on its own. It's saying the British Empire, the Commonwealth, the world is in this war. So I'm intrigued why we've ended up with this narrative of the Little England, the Arthur Lowe in Dad's Army kind of image. It's because it's not what they were conveying then, is it?
That's right. And I think it's a great question, and there's a lot of answers to that question. One of the answers is about strong fictional portrayals. So, like Dad's Army, that's a classic.
Yeah.
Colditz also for people of my generation. Yeah. But also that 2017 film by Christopher Nolan. He missed an opportunity there. But I mean. Colditz. Okay, so there were Indian soldiers at Colditz, including one of these guys. I mean, it's just not. So why has that been forgotten? Well, I'm part of it is also about that nobody has bothered to bring the information together. I mean, my research process was a long process, and it involved I went to India, I went to Pakistan, I went to Germany, I went to France, I went all around the UK, and it was a number of years, and it was really a question of assembling clues. No one else had bothered to do that. But also that I think if there were historians of South Asian heritage at any stage in the last 70 odd years who thought this was important, they would have put it together. And I think that's part of the question, part of the reason for this forgetting is that in South Asia, in India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, these men are not seen, and indeed the broader Indian army in the Second World War are not seen as being particularly important, not seeing as being part of the narrative of the 20th century. When the first time I went to India, I went into a bookshop in Jaipur, and I went to the Second World War shelves. Every bookshop in Britain has shelves and shelves and shelves of stuff on Second World War. Yeah. This bookshop in India, there was no Second World War shelf. There were 2 or 3 books. But there were shelves on independence. That's what the 20th century was about. It was about, 1947, and everything else was leading up to that.
And that's, and this is going to be the theme we're talking about this week. I talked about it with Sri yesterday, this sense that the modern historians from India, from Nepal, from Pakistan, and even from Britain with Indian or Pakistani heritage, the sense of rediscovery in this history, and it hopefully the next generation will be people with a deeper connection to this, writing about this and expanding on this. Yeah. And I mean, for example, though Robert Lyman is always keen to talk about all the forces that made up the 14th Army in Burma, there will be Indian. Well, there already are Indian historians talking about that. There'll be it is on the brink of being reclaimed. I think that history, which is we're good. But we'll bring back to your. Otherwise, we'll go down these rabbit holes. So you provide us again these. Well, this is about hockey. So
this I love this story because in 1936 there was 1936 Olympics took place in Berlin, and the Indian hockey team they went through all of the rounds up to the semi-final without having a single goal scored against them. The final of the hockey the 1936 Olympics was between India and Germany, and the hosts, and there they are in this enormous stadium with all this fascist stuff, and Hitler himself was there, and India won 8-1. The Germans were the only people who managed to get a goal past the Indians, and afterwards. Apparently, Hitler said to the captain of the Indian team, he offered him the opportunity to join the German army and join the German team, which he declined. So 1930s, 1940s, hockey, India, they are supreme. They're the kind of bosses of hockey. So this is a letter that was given to me by a chap who lives in Devon, in Kingsbridge, in South Devon, and this is what he wrote. During the World War II, my father, Dennis Casely, ran a very successful youth club in Kingsbridge. Knowing that the RIASC were billeted at Woodley Monastery, they were contacted and invited to a game in Kingsbridge, which they were delighted to accept. After the match, in which the Indians scored 4 goals, both teams trooped off to the Cozy Cafe. That sounds good, doesn't it? Cozy Cafe for tea, and I went along with my parents to join them. I remember them being calm, polite, very pleasant men, and I was certainly included in their company. My dad managed to find an envelope, which he opened out and asked them to list the members of their side, which one of them did. And this guy, Patrick Casely, kept this envelope, and I just love this. And so there's the names of the 11 members of the team. So the captain is Sardar Ali. He's a Jemadar. He's an Indian officer, and tells you who scored the goals. And then so the 11 guys, and it's interestingly, 10 of those names are Muslim names, but number 7 is Rakha, which is not a Muslim. So he was probably a Hindu. He was a sweeper. So his job was to clean up, poo, excrement, but to clean up everything else. Every company had, I think, 3 sweepers attached to them. And he would have been from what was known in India as an untouchable caste, a Dalit caste. Interestingly, no problem. He was good enough at hockey. So, that hockey skill triumphed over the fact that he was from a different caste. However, these guys are Muslims, so they wouldn't have perceived that so strongly. But he joined the team, and they beat the local boys.
And it's interesting because Sri said the same thing yesterday about the Indian Air Force, that they had to kind of, for necessity, forget the caste system, forget the different, because it would be ridiculous to start having different rules for everybody. They just realized, look, we may have differences within our own culture, but we are now the aliens within another culture. So we need to unite and combine and put those differences aside, because we're all the outsiders now. It's important to understand how often the services are the first to integrate better. They're the ones often pushing racial acceptance faster than the civilian life. It's fascinating.
That's certainly true in the Indian Air Force and in the Royal Indian Navy. Less true in the Army, increasingly true as the war went on. So this is a cutting from the Daily Mirror. So a number of them were killed these guys were killed in an accident. This was in Cornwall. There was a hurricane, tree fell over and squashed their barrack. And this was from the Daily Mirror. So the title was Home Guard Tribute to Dead Indians. The lids of the coffins were off, revealing the dead men, each clad in 3 sets of spotless white linen. The Indian mourners stood barefooted, softly chanting the prayers which their Mulvi, Indian chaplain, intoned. And it talks about wreaths of English roses, which I think is lovely when you think about these guys. And then slowly the coffins were borne 2 miles to a military cemetery. And on the way, the Indian bearers and escort sang of man's coming and going and of the will and goodness of Allah. So those 3 guys, in fact, are buried in Charlestown, which is just sort of south of St. Austell. This photo is also from Cornwall. This is from Truro. This shows, I know that the white guy is Major Finlay, who was their subunit, which was supplied the suppliers. and these are some of his VCOs around with him. He was a great guy. He was a great writer. He wrote some really interesting things about them. What comes up next? I can't remember what else we got.
About the religion, yeah, which is important. I think.
Very important aspect. So this photo comes from Woking. So just 20 miles southwest of London, there's a town called Woking, and next to the railway there is the oldest mosque in Britain, the oldest purpose-built mosque in Britain, which was built in 1889. A beautiful, very small, very elegant little mosque. And these guys. So this is Chaudhry Wali Muhammad was in the 25th company or the 25th company. So he was at Dunkirk, and he wrote on a few days after they had arrived back in Britain. We were all very puzzled how in this foreign land there could exist a mosque, particularly as no Muslims seemed to live here. Soon after sunrise the next morning, which was Friday, the June 7th, we gathered together and marched to Woking. When we were a short distance away, we saw this small but beautiful mosque. We offered our prayers and thanked God for the opportunity to pray there. So, and he, in fact, he like most of them, he went back to India and lived most of his life in Pakistan. But his son migrated to Britain and now runs a taxi company right there in Woking. So there's a lovely kind of connection there. And Woking Mosque was their leave centre for quite a long time. But everywhere they went, they needed places to pray. So there's actually film footage of them praying in the open air in Ashbourne in Derbyshire, and in Lairg, which is right up in the north of Scotland, north of Inverness. That was their northernmost place. They used an old iron building, a corrugated iron building, which had previously been a church.
Well, I know everyone who's watching this is thinking, and we don't need to go explore this too much, but they're all thinking, if this is also going so harmoniously in the 1940s, why did everything go backward 2 decades later, post Windrush, post everything else? Why, if this was all going on with acceptance and tolerance and mutual respect, why did things go backwards to, in the future? I know we can't explore that idea. I just like the fact that there is this togetherness in World War II. Maybe it's the fact that everybody is facing adversity so much. And I suppose if you're British and you're from Cornwall or Devon, you're facing the threat of the Nazis. And I suppose maybe it's opening your mind to working with people different to yourselves more so than, I don't know. It's fascinating, but it's sad that things got so bad later on.
It is interesting. There's only one story of racism that I actually came across that was documented. I'm sure there were other instances of racism, but I think there is something about, what happened in Britain in the summer of 1945, the end of the war. There was a change in everything changed. It was, the victory was very much moved quickly into this idea of rebuilding. And India became independent. India and Pakistan became independent very soon, within 2 years after the end of the war. So there was a sense of moving on, and part of that, I think, was a sense of moving on from this, what you say, the sense of working together. Yeah,
sad. So we won't exploit it too much, but we'll keep on with these amazing stories because I'm enjoying this a lot, and I'm sure the viewers are too.
So this is one of them. This is probably not a photo of him. This is just a photo that I put in there. But so, of course, every company had a veterinary officer with them, who was a jemadar, a viceroy's commissioned officer. This particular officer was remembered. So they were posted up in the north, Snowdonia, in the north of Wales, for a few months in 1943, doing some more training with British units there, right up in the mountains, tiny little hamlet. And Watkin Evans was he was a boy at the time. He said, I remember there was a doctor there and he used to come up to the house, an Indian doctor, a tall chap, a big man, and he came up to Coed Tea, which was the name of the house, nearly every day. And every time he comes in straight upstairs and he wanted a towel and he was praying on the towel in the bedroom. I remember my brother and I was playing, and I don't know how I hit my brother with a stone and he was bleeding. I like the way he says, I don't know how I hit him with a stone. And as soon as I did that, 20 minutes after, this doctor came up and took him up and went down to the camp and came back and stitched it up for him. So he's a veterinary officer. He's not a doctor for people. Stitched it up for him. The same time every day he came up to pray in the evening. He used to pray for about 10 minutes. We used to peep to see what was going on, but he would close the door. One couldn't hear him. My parents didn't mind. He was a nice chap, a very nice chap, very polite, with quite good English. Some of them couldn't speak English at all, and we all spoke Welsh. Communication was a bit patchy. I love that sense that, you know, that the local people didn't have much English. These guys didn't have much English, but nevertheless, they got on and they managed to communicate with each other. And so this Giovanna Bloor, she was a wonderful woman who did a lot of research about these guys. She's the one on the right with the trousers on. And she interviewed this guy called Edgar Parry Williams, who remembered that they had come into his school. What this Jemidar Malik Muhammad Khan had come into his school. He asked to hear them singing some songs, and then he taught them a couple of songs. And 70 odd years later, he remembered the song.
I'll play it for everybody now. So here we go.
Sunate, sunate, sunate Krishna, Opannarik Jallo, sunate Krishna. And there's another one. Iranake mulukumu adunatu sara ataisa hutamere mure mustafa.
I mean, that is insane. I mean, that is brilliant, but it is insane that all those years later, someone is remembering something taught to them by an Indian soldier decades. It's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. Yeah, he was probably about 10 at the time. It's a lovely interview. That interview, he remembers so many things about them. So this is, if just go back one. So yeah, that one there. So this is Helen McKee. She was commissioned to do this poster really for Waterloo Station during the middle of the war. It's a lovely picture that kind of brings together all the hustle and bustle, you know. And you've got the RAF in there, you've got the Navy in there, you've got a copper at the front, you've got some American soldiers, you've got a Polish soldier at the foreground with a shapka on, Highlanders. Yeah. You know, and there in the middle,
Nuns, Land Army girls. There's the MP, red cap. There's everything in that photo.
Everything is there. Everything. And there in the middle are these two Indian soldiers with their puggarees, with their rifles, watching the world go by. And I just kind of think it's a bit emblematic, you know. I mean, they would have been at Waterloo quite a lot because it's the station that you go to for Woking. So they would have been going through there on a regular basis on the way to their leave centre. But there they are, and nobody realises that they're there. This picture has been made into a jigsaw, which you can get from the London Transport Museum. And all these people, I like to think about all these people piecing together this picture over, you know, the last how many years. And they kind of, you know, they see these Indian soldiers in the middle and they don't know kind of quite what they're doing. So it's like they're hiding in plain sight, you know. They were in
plain sight, yeah. But it's as you said, it's emblematic of the fact that the war was, even at the time, portrayed in a much more universal way than it has ended up being portrayed 20, 30 years later. I like to think we're bucking the trend now and trying to appreciate the multinationals, but the side of things. But yeah, back in the war, it was a you know, you walk down London, you'd hear every language, see every type of uniform and kepis and shakas and turbans and it was beautiful.
Yeah, and part of that reclaiming is the portrait of Muhammad Akbar Khan is at the Imperial War Museum, and it's going to be part of their new permanent display that's coming on later this year.
And that's so important. I mean, your work is so important. I mean, I was last at the National Army Museum. I know you said that. You said Imperial War Museum. I was at the National Army Museum a couple of years ago. And of course, the school groups that are going through there these days, there's every color under the sun in those school groups now. And it's important that they see themselves in museums. It's important they see people of the same color as them and the same background as them and the same language as them. And you know, reinforcing this idea of all the Tommies being either, as I said earlier, upper class or working or Cockneys is not helping anybody. It's
absolutely.
The more diverse it is, the better. So obviously a couple of sad photos here.
Yeah, so there are 58 of them buried in graves in Britain, France, and Germany. Most of them died of illness rather than of casualties in action. There are 3 graves in Plymouth. And then there are several others across the country. The largest concentration is in Scotland, a place called Kingussie. So I think that's the next slide. So here they are. There's 9 of them buried in Kingussie, which is in the Highlands, back of nowhere. And I was very honored to go to this ceremony a few years ago around Remembrance time. Highland soldiers there. There are 2 chaplains. The tall guy is a Church of Scotland chaplain, and the shorter guy is the Muslim chaplain for the British Armed Forces. And they did this wonderful ceremony to remember them. And And they these particular graves have been looked after since then by a wonderful woman called Isabel Harling. So I'll just read you this poem, which is a poem you may well know, but I'm just going to transpose the words because these guys were from Punjab. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever Punjab. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a Dutch whom Punjab bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of Punjabs, breathing Punjabi air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home.
And there is Isabel there, yeah.
So she was given the British Empire Medal last year. Yes, it was last year, because she's been looking after these graves for 70 odd years herself. Fantastic. What a wonderful woman. And what a great connection between this, very ordinary Scottish woman and these guys who'd come 7,000 miles to help, to be here, to be part of the war effort in Britain.
And so important, I think, Guy, as well, to just be giving out positive messages. I mean, we did Tragedies and Disasters Week last week on World War II TV, and it all got a bit bleak. Well, with Lidice and Manila and murders everywhere, and it's nice. And of course, there's always tragedy, but the fact that there are deep bonds created is it's such a positive story. That when people are interested in history can be perceived as someone's being a bit geeky and sad with their model Spitfires hanging from their ceilings, wherever it would be. But the point is history connects people, and the fact that there are these deep connections because of this is so important and so wonderful to hear. And the photos are so good.
Exactly. I mean, I'm a social and cultural historian. I know some stuff about military history, but I'm interested in people. I'm interested in human beings and their relations and their difficulties and how they, how they get together. So yeah, the photo on the right is from North Wales. Typical photo of a kind of, of a family with a guy who would have, I imagine, was one of the ones who dropped in regularly. There's a lot of stories I've heard about people who had a regular visitor. The guy on the left is Sergeant. I think he's next to the radio. He's part of the furniture in this household. And that really just strong connections. How much time have we got, Paul?
No, we can keep going. It's fine. Everyone's enjoying. People are loving it. If you're all right, I'm all right. Yeah.
All right. So I can go on for. I think my dinner might be calling me. But so this is one of the most interesting story. So this is St Austell. This is the centre of St Austell in Cornwall. Here they are marching through the streets, and this woman called Gladys Shapland. She was a young woman. She was married to a guy who was posted away in Plymouth, working in the shipyards. He was a bit of a boozer. He liked to drink. So she was at home with her two young children, a son and a daughter. And in the middle of 1942, along comes another son, and a little bit later, another son. And those are the two boys we see in the photo there. And Jeff is the shorter one. He grew up, so he was the son of one of these Indian soldiers, but he didn't know that. He grew up thinking that his dad was this boozy ship worker in Plymouth who died in 1948. And for years and years and years after the war, he didn't know the truth about his father, but his skin was a bit darker than his brother and sister. And he and throughout his life, he became a scientist, he became a teacher, he became a head teacher in Leicestershire. He's still alive. He's a lovely, lovely man. And he, over the years, people would kind of, sort of talk about him or kind of be a bit racist towards him, or kids in the school in Leicestershire would say, Sir, my mum wants to know, are you Asian, sir? And he said, no, I'm from Cornwall. My dad's he's still got a Cornish accent. My dad's a Cornishman. My mum's a Cornish woman. And then, but over the years, the kind of doubts built up, and eventually, his sister, his older sister, said, yeah, I remember back in the war, there was an Indian soldier whose name was Jamal Khan, who used to come and visit, and he used to stay and sleep downstairs on the bed in the front room. And they kind of looked at each other, and he thought, uh-oh. And his mum was still alive. But his mum had never said anything, and he couldn't bring himself to talk to his mother about it. But later, the four children had DNA tests, which proved that him and his brother had a different father from his older brother and his older sister. And then after his mum died, the stories started to come out from neighbors, from other members of the family, you know, saying that actually, yes, it was well known that his father was one of the Indian soldiers. And one of the interesting things about the story is the way he has come to terms with it and that he has embraced that. And I asked him, you know, do you see Jamal Khan as your father? And he said, yes, absolutely, he's my father. I never knew him, you know, I don't remember him. There was a photo of him and with his father together that his mother had destroyed. His mother didn't want to tell him and his brother the truth because of the shames, the secrets and lies. You know, it was a double shame of infidelity and of, you know, having a father who was a person of color. You know, and so there he is. That's him when I interviewed him a couple of years ago in Leicestershire. Absolutely lovely man. But what's so great about him is the way that he has embraced this and taken on this fact that his father is somebody different and whom he, you know, and I kind of still have this hope. As I say, I went to Pakistan to do some research. I still have this hope that one day we will find a missing, we won't find his dad, but we'll find a kind of missing brother or sister.
Just such an inspiring story about acceptance and tolerance, and yeah, we could keep on going, but yeah.
So just this, I think this is one of the last. I can't remember how many slides I put on there. So
nearly there.
Steepholm is a funny little island in the Bristol Channel. So between Weston-super-Mare and Cardiff, there are two islands, Steepholm and Flatholm, and they decided to fortify them as a, you know, to protect Bristol and Cardiff and various other parts. And so this Royal Engineering officer, whose name was Berklin, he was sent there to build gun emplacements to get the guns up there, 6-inch naval guns, and of course they couldn't get the stuff up the hill other than with mules. So there was a small detachment of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps was sent there. Excuse me, I think it was about 20 of them with mules, and they stayed there for several months through the winter. Very difficult conditions. They'd be cut off for days on end when they couldn't get the supply boats in. They had some typhoid on the island, and they hauled these guns, you know, up the cliff using these mules. You know, they were working there. They were working very hard to fortify Steepholm, you know, which was an important link in the chain of defences. This photo
and clear. This is again proof of the fact you've clearly done your research, because it's, you know, the unearthing these stories about what these guys did. It's just so important. It's brilliant stuff.
Yeah. This is back in 1940. This is the King meeting some of them in Ashbourne in Derbyshire. And there's lots of film of that, so you can find that on YouTube.
Yeah, there's links in the description below, folks, to some of these Pathé films, so you can go and find them. And of course, there's links to Ghee's film books or book, and the website he has about this force. So it's all there as usual for you in the description, folks. And I urge you to go out and investigate this more, because it's just such a brilliant story. So obviously back to sort of Gymkhana almost days now.
Yeah. This is France, 1940. This is them exactly showing off their tricks. Yeah. And this is a lovely one. This is also from Ashbourne, summer of 1940, middle of England. They were all united there together and decorating their camp. And there's a long story in the local paper, the Ashbourne Telegraph, about how they done these decorations with stones around every tent and centrally as well. Yeah. And there they are, 5 of them. So we've got Paddy Ashdown, we've got Zubair Mohammed in the top corner. He's the taxi driver, firm owner. We've got Colin Hexley in the top right-hand corner. He lives on the coast of Scotland. And the bottom right, we've got, oh God, I remember the name of the parrot, but I can't remember the name of the lady.
That's unfortunate.
The parrot's called Gul Matol, and she's the daughter of, her name is Zenat. Thank you, Zenat Ziad. She's the daughter of Captain Anis, who is one of their officers there on the bottom right. Yeah, so they're all the offspring of these soldiers, you know, and
wonderful.
This interesting mixture of British and Indian. So
you say your dinner's calling you, but just to kind of finish things off, obviously your book's in English language, it's being read by people, you're telling people, and next you've got. What's the interest been so far in India or in Pakistan? I mean, has it been picked up there?
Well, thank you for saying that, because there's going to be an Indian edition coming out at the beginning of September. So Macmillan have picked it up, and they're going to make an Indian edition. So also in English. It hasn't been translated. But and in Pakistan, there has been quite a lot of interest. There was a review in one of the big daily papers there, very, very favorable review. Difficult to get in Pakistan, difficult for them to buy. And of course, there is still this question about, is the war is not that important when viewed from India or Pakistan. It's still secondary importance after the freedom struggle and the.
I get that, but to me, it's about how it's kind of marketed, because you say, in terms of cultural history, it's important. It's important to understand. Forget about the military side, just to understand how they could travel overseas, these people, and make themselves accepted, be accepted. Share their culture with others, and that's a universal message, whether or not you're interested in the war side of it at all. We are. I don't want to go down to the ranting mode, but we're in a world where we've been divided everywhere, over what we think about COVID and vaccines and Trump and Johnson and this, that, and the other. And these stories are all about showing what people can do when they work together, and bringing people together, and cultures and different opinions and different religions, and that's, I think, the message we shall leave it with tonight, that these cultures can and did work together, and that's more important to me than whether this unit was in Lille or Lyon in May 40. What's more important is this symbolism of what this story represents, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I'll let you. I'll just remind folks we're coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, I've thoroughly enjoyed today's show. I enjoy every single show I do, but I just really enjoyed this one. Great presenter, great story, and an uplifting story. In the last week's shows were a little bit bleak. This is a little bit more positive to talk about today, and we're carrying on the same theme with Kiran Sahoja tomorrow about the way South Asian history is being explored by younger people in Britain. So lots more stories tomorrow. So that'll be the same time, 7 p.m. UK tomorrow. As always, don't forget, check us out on Patreon. All the links are there below. Go and order a copy of Dr. Bowman's book. Look at the Pathé footage, and start learning more about this subject, because it's very interesting. So, but anyway, back to you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Did you enjoy it as well?
I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much. Yeah, great.
Well, yeah, no, it's been great. So, I'll let you go and have your dinner, and I'm going to unstick myself from my chair because my back has sweated through to the plastic. But we'll see everybody tomorrow. And thanks everybody for watching. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying thank you very much for giving your evening to us to learn about this important bit of history. Good night, everybody. Cheers.